Katie from the UK is a software engineer at Capital One, and Katie also organises JavaScript meetups, for example Knots.js and Midlands.js. Today, Katie's going to teach us about game development with JavaScript. And JavaScript often isn't considered the go-to language when developing games. However, there's a lot of possibilities beyond the typical games that we see all the time with vanilla JS, things like Pong or Space Invaders. So with the help of a few libraries and a bit of practice, you can jump into making games for the desktop, mobile, and even the smartwatch. This sounds super excited. Katie, over to you. I cannot wait to hear more.
Hi, I'm Katie, and I'm here to talk about game development with JavaScript. So, as I said, hi, I'm Katie. I currently work as a software engineer in fintech. My background is in computer science and maths, and I'm a really big video games fan. So I kind of want to stress here that I did a couple of months a while ago as a game developer, but apart from that, I'm like a complete hobbyist when it comes to game development, and hopefully that'll kind of be a bit more relatable to you. So hopefully you can see that you don't necessarily need to be a kind of big shot game developer to make games. It can really just be a side hobby like it is for me if you want. So what are the aims of this talk? Firstly, I just kind of want to inform you of what's actually out there for game development using JavaScript, because I think it's one of those things that people don't generally associate them together. I definitely didn't when I was growing up and learning programming for the first time. You know, usually you'd use a language like C++ or C# if you wanted to make a game. But actually, there are loads of libraries, loads of things out there to help you do game development with JavaScript. So just want to kind of show you what those are and how you can get involved with them. I'm going to cover kind of what the main areas of like things you consider when you're making a game, and these don't always necessarily mean JavaScript specific things, but they can be kind of very general. Of course, I will put a JavaScript spin on it for this talk. I'm not going to be going through any code in real depth because I think at the end of the day, you're probably a lot better off following a nice tutorial online or using some documentation than trying to follow me kind of live coding at a conference. So hopefully if you do see like a library you want to pick up or something you want to get involved with, if you have a quick Google afterwards, you'll be able to find like loads of tutorials, documentation to get started. Really, I just want to inspire people to give it a go. As I said, people don't usually associate the two things together. So if you kind of see this talk and you think, oh, actually, that could be quite fun, I'd like to give it a go, then that is great with me. So why do I think that you should develop games? They're really fun. Obviously, they're games, they're made to be fun. They're really fun to develop, I think, and play, obviously, and also testing, surprisingly fun. You know, during my day job, I do a lot of stuff kind of on the back end with like databases and things like that. And, you know, when things go wrong, it can be really, really frustrating and quite really annoying just to fix them a lot of the time because they're not really very fun bugs. You know, they're usually something like, right, the database has gone wrong, etc. However, when you're making games, sometimes the bugs you get can be really funny. So like you might be making like a platformer and, you know, your player maybe isn't behaving quite right and maybe they're like falling through the floor or they're just disappearing or, you know, flying off in space. And it's things like that that really make it kind of fun. And even though when you're like stuck in the realms of like deep debugging and it can get really hard and rough, you know, you can't help but smile and kind of be chuckle a little bit if you see your like player flying off in space. So, you know, sometimes they can be quite fun to develop in that way. Of course, everything nowadays kind of is labeled as a side hustle, and you know that doesn't have to be the same for you. But if you are like incentivized by the possibility of making money from your like hobby project, then that is possible. It's probably different to what you do during the day. You know, of course, if you're a game developer, this doesn't kind of apply to you. But for like most software engineers, doing some game development in your spare time is probably different to what you do during the day, and that can be great because I found when I was doing a lot of web development, you know, I was doing like React development all day, and I was coming home and making websites and doing more React development, and it all kind of just blurred into one, and it didn't feel fun anymore. Whereas now I've kind of got a nice distinction. So, why JavaScript? Well, given the topic of the conference, you probably do know it already. Or if you don't know it, then you're probably interested in knowing it. Therefore, you don't need to actually go out and learn a whole new syntax. And I think that's what really put me off at the beginning of game development, because I didn't want to go and learn like C++ and pick up a whole new language and learn all the new syntax when I was already doing like few different things at once during university. So by picking up a language that you already know, it does make your life a lot easier because, of course, you're going to have to learn some like game development specific stuff. You're not going to have to learn how to like define variables or do loops or functions, etc. JavaScript's really portable. By default, it's going to run on the browser, which means you can run it on your mobile, on your computer, and hopefully you'll see later in the talk when we talk about like frameworks and libraries and how you can like export your code onto different platforms. So like if they run as native apps, you can broaden the horizon even more in terms of where you put your code. And of course, it's JavaScript. There are loads and loads of frameworks out there. So when I first started looking into game development with JavaScript, I kind of thought, well, let's go see what's out there and how I can actually get started. And the kind of most common example I found was things like Pong and Breakout and Space Invaders and those kind of like simple retro arcade games. And I think these are really great as a tutorial, as like a stepping stone to making games, but they didn't really inspire me to like go out and think, oh yes, I want to one day become a like master game developer with JavaScript. It just didn't quite do it for me, and I didn't really think, if I learn this, is it actually going to go anywhere? Can I make anything really exciting in the future? So I looked a bit further and I found this game called Orange Season, and it's kind of like Stardew Valley or like Animal Crossing, that kind of thing. It's like an RPG style game where you like fish and farm food and fight monsters and things, and it's like a full game. You can actually buy it on itch.io, which is really cool. And it's things like this that really inspire me to think, okay, actually, if I get really good at this, in a few years' time, when if I put a lot of effort in and I learn this really well, actually, I can make something quite impressive. So it's things like this that really inspire me to think, okay, let's do it. So if you want to make a game, what do you want to consider before you get started? Specifically, before you start programming. Now, I think the biggest thing to think here is plan, plan, and plan. With all software projects, it's important to have some kind of a plan before you get started. But specifically, I think in game development, if you start kind of making big decisions quite early on without thinking about actually the direction you want your game to go in, you might end up getting a few hours in and actually having to scrap what you've done because you've actually decided, I want to go a different route. For example, if you start developing like a 2D game and then you think, actually, I want to make the next Skyrim, well, actually, maybe 3D would be better. So you're going to have to scrap all of that work you've done specific for the 2D stuff and start again, basically. So first, we're going to look at the non-technical side. And this is kind of the game design part of it. So firstly, you want to think, what do I want the theme of my game to be? Is it going to have puzzles in it? Maybe it's going to be like a retro style game. Is it going to have levels? Is there going to be some kind of movement in this game? For example, is there a player? Are you going to have to add kind of some kind of system to allow them to move around the map? Are they going to be able to jump? If so, you might need to add some physics to the game. Are there enemies? You might want to go down the object-oriented route if you're going to be making lots of enemies and like spawning them in random places. And then there's additional features. Is there multiplayer? Are you going to have to add something like sockets to the game? Do you want the player to be able to save the game? There's all kind of things like this that if you answer these kind of questions early on, you can start to see about the direction that you want your game to go in. I think it's really important to design the game around your skill level. And I think there's kind of two skill levels involved with this. One of them will be your maybe your JavaScript technical ability. If you're a really proficient JavaScript developer, you're going to find a lot of the writing of the code may be quite simple. However, there's also the side of making a game that is kind of matches your skill level and what's achievable for you. You might only have 30 minutes a day to work on this for the next couple of weeks. You're going to have to make a game that is realistically going to get finished in that time. So it's just important to kind of consider what skill level you are when you're started creating the game. Because a lot of the technical elements are going to just depend on the game design. If you're going to add multiplayer, that's going to be quite a lot more difficult than just adding a one-person player running around the screen. So you need to really consider how far do you push your game design and how out there do you maybe make some of the mechanics because you need to be able to technically program it as well. However, I don't think that everything in your design needs to be concrete. There's going to be some things like, if you decide, okay, I've got a player, it's going to be some kind of like farming game maybe, and you've got some kind of details planned out, but you can't decide whether your player is going to be a human or an elf, for example. I don't think things like that are going to really hold you back. As long as there's no major differences between these two players, then it doesn't matter if you come back to this detail later on. You can really finalize them at a later date. So let's look at the technical side. First of all, maybe do you want to use a framework? Unfortunately, there is a little bit of a stigma with JavaScript frameworks and libraries that sometimes they don't necessarily last the test of time, and they kind of fizzle out and no one maintains them and whatnot. But hopefully, I think if you pick a framework that has a lot of backing, like some of the ones I'm going to show you in a minute, hopefully they will survive long enough for you to get your game out there. Now, of course, you don't necessarily have to use a framework if you don't want to. You could just do it with vanilla HTML and JavaScript. And I think the benefit of this is obviously you're not going to have to learn any more libraries, so you're not going to have to invest that time picking up some library-specific syntax. It's also really great for learning the basics of building an engine. It can be quite hard work building an engine from scratch, but actually I think you get a real appreciation of the craft if you do it. If you're going to implement physics to the game and you're not going to use a framework to handle that for you, then I think learning from scratch can be a really valuable experience if that's something you're interested in. I do think this will take you more time, especially if it's not something you've done before. So it's kind of where you want to kind of allocate your time. Do you want to maybe spend a bit longer learning a new library and learning the new functions and kind of details around that? Or do you want to put that time into building it from scratch exactly how you like it? It is also as lightweight as you can get if you're not adding all this extra bulk and dependencies on top, which can be really good specifically for things like mobile games if you want them to be really light and work on really low-end devices that maybe don't have a lot of processing power. However, I do think it can be quite limiting, especially for things like native app development. I'm going to go through some frameworks that let you take your JavaScript and basically port it to a native app, which means it'll run on your phone like an app rather than through like the browser. So I don't know how you do that without any frameworks at all. So you might be a lot easier just to use one in that case. The same with 3D development. There's only so much you can do in the browser. So there are a lot of frameworks that you can kind of pick off the shelf and use for one or two aspects of the game. So you might pick off one for like physics, one for maybe rendering your sprites, things like that. But actually there are kind of all-in-one solutions that are like handle everything for you, such as Phaser.js. So this is kind of the Unity of JavaScript game development. It handles like everything for you basically, from like physics and sprites and animation, sound. I think it has some kind of like exporting as well, so you can export it as like an actual mobile app to put on the App Store. And it kind of handles all of those details for you, so you just have to focus on actually making the game. This is a game that was quite popular, I think, a few years ago. I think I ended up playing it for like 2 weeks. It was really addictive, actually. But I do remember how much of a nice game it was. Like it looked really professional. And then when I found out a short while later that it was made with JavaScript, like I was super impressed. That's pretty cool. Kiwi.js. So this is kind of an open source equivalent of Phaser. I think it's a little bit less well known, a little bit less widely used, but as it's open source, it's quite popular if you're into open source. It uses WebGL, so this makes it really fast and efficient. WebGL is kind of the equivalent of OpenGL for like non-web applications. So it means that you can kind of make use of your graphics card, which makes animations really cool and like really detailed without it affecting performance. From what I remember, Kiwi is quite lightweight, and you can kind of get plugins of everything that you want to kind of add on top of the base. So if you want to add like sprite support or like social media integration, you can download a plugin for it. And there were loads and loads of tutorials available when I last looked. I think that is kind of a really big thing when you're a beginner. Documentation is great, but it can kind of only take you so far if you're not as experienced. I found personally that if I was just reading from some like averagely written docs, I found it really hard to get started with any framework when it came to game development, or I suppose in general, really, when you're not super confident with just picking up like the documentation for the different like methods available. It's just kind of not enough. So I think tutorials are really awesome in this sense. Next, we want to look at the platform you actually want to run the device or run the game on, because I think this will affect the type of game that you create, and of course it'll influence what kind of frameworks you use, because they'll have different support for different devices. You know, if you want to make the next Skyrim, probably best not to try and run this on the phone. You know, if it's going to be in your head like as big as Skyrim and as in like graphically intense, you know, this kind of thing isn't going to run very easily on the phone. So it's kind of going to influence you to maybe make a desktop app instead. So you might think that JavaScript is just browsers, but you can actually do loads with it. There's also like obviously the web as part of the browser, but you can also make native desktop apps, mobile apps, and even smartwatch. So of course the browser. So if you're already hosting a website, it's going to be super, super easy for you to get started with just getting a game up and running. Pretty much everything I've seen framework-wise like just works with the browser. You know, you don't need to add anything extra on top of it to work with the browser, which is pretty cool. Of course, if you put it on a website, you know, people don't have to sign up to anything or download anything or install anything, which makes it really, really accessible. And if you really wanted to, you could maybe add some adverts to monetize it. If you're a bit like, I don't know, thinking about like Minikclip a few years ago, that could be your next side project. And then there's mobile. So you can package your game for the app stores, which I think is really, really cool. Mobile games are like huge at the moment, especially with lockdown. Like, what else is anyone doing? It's mobile games. Like, my parents still love Candy Crush. So yeah, they're really big in sales. I think what I personally love about mobile game development is how simple a lot of them are. Most of them just have like a really simple mechanic, and it's quite repetitive and very addictive, of course, which makes them so popular. And I think it's really great if you're a beginner, because you can come up with quite a quick game with simple mechanics and whatnot, and ship it quite quickly. And actually, it's probably going to be on par with a lot of the games on the App Store. You know, some of them are awful, to be honest, but I'm sure you could do a lot better given a bit of time. So yeah, I think the simplicity is what makes it so attractive for a beginner like myself. And then smartwatch. I'm going to say it's quite niche. Definitely a few years ago, I feel like smartwatches were more popular. So yeah, maybe not so useful anymore, but if you maybe have a smartwatch knocking around, this might be applicable to you. Also, watches are not very powerful. I think even when they got super popular, and even now looking at the new series of Apple Watches, you know, they're not exactly beasts when it comes to processing, so that means they can't exactly run the most intense games. However, if you wanted to, and you want to show off the product to your friends, you can use things like NativeScript and Meteor to get games on your smartwatch. So I think this is specifically for the Android smartwatches, but I'm sure there'll be equivalent for Apple Watches if you wanted. So now we've looked at platform, device, etc. Now we want to look at actually rendering your sprites or your models. So one of the ways you can do this is using WebGL. So as I said, WebGL is the kind of equivalent to OpenGL. It's a 2 and 3D graphics renderer for JavaScript, and it kind of makes use of the canvas. It's good for high performance animations. You know, if you look at any big kind of AAA game, not necessarily JavaScript, but things like Cyberpunk or whatever, they'll be using OpenGL, I assume, to render all the really high performance graphics. So WebGL is the equivalent, so it kind of is also used for really high performance graphics. It is very, very low level. You know, you're not going to get anything visible nice on the screen without like 20, 30, 50, 100 lines of code. It is very low level in that sense, which is great if you want a lot of control, but it's not going to like make it super quick for you to develop like that donut animation on the right. And there's something called Phaser.js. So this is also a 2D and 3D graphics renderer for the canvas. And what I like about it is that it makes use of WebGL without actually needing the knowledge of WebGL, which means it's a hell of a lot less low level with a few lines of code of Pixie equivalent to like 100 lines of WebGL. It has sprite sheet support, shader support, multi-platform support, it's got loads, and it's open source, which is really cool. So super quickly, there's a bit of code here which kind of shows how I did that spinning plane animation. So how it works is it's a sprite sheet that's got, I think, 30 different like static images on of slightly different rotations of the jet. And this is kind of how I add to the screen. So you just loop through the sprite sheet and you push each of the frames. And then you kind of do a little bit of just Pixie stuff to set the location, play the animation, the speed, whatnot, and then you add it to the stage. So yeah, it's nice and easy to get started with Pixie, and you can make really cool looking graphics quite quickly. So now we want to look at maybe whether you want 2D or 3D games. So of course 2D is definitely more performant on mobile. You know, when you're not having to add that extra axis, it's going to be a lot quicker on your phone. You can also use a pixel art style, which I think is really good as a beginner. It's definitely a lot easier than trying to do these like really beautiful 2D graphics. Of course, you only have the two axes, and that's less complexity for the device to handle, but also for you as a developer to write. And it doesn't necessarily require framer if you don't want to. So as I said before, you can of course go completely vanilla with 2D if you like. 3D, depending on what kind of game you make, it might be a little bit more suitable. For example, the whole Skyrim example. Yeah, if you wanted to make the next Skyrim, you probably want to go 3D. There are also, I think, more opportunities for nice visuals, like using shaders. You know, I've seen some really beautiful 2D games, but if you look at like the top end of like 2D games versus the top end of 3D games, like 3D is definitely more realistic and can be more attractive. You are probably going to need some kind of form of WebGL. So if you want to dive into WebGL yourself, it might be a little bit more time consuming, or of course you could use a framework like Pixie to handle it for you. Then we have the art. So I don't know about you, but I am not artistic in any way. I'm very jealous of my like software engineering friends who are. I'd say just start with really basic designs. You know, even if they ended up like that weird looking Pikachu, it's, you know, it's a start. Everyone starts from somewhere, and I think with a bit of practice, you can definitely get better at it. There are loads of tutorials online, and I think with following a few of them, hopefully you can start to pick up an art style that you enjoy, and I think it will come naturally after kind of a few sessions. And of course, if that doesn't work, you can always leave it to the end. Personally, when I make games, I like to start with like pretty but very, very basic like squares and things, and then if I actually get to the end of the game, that's when I start to like put in the time to make 2D sprites and whatnot. And also as a last resort, you could find someone else's designs. You can get them like online for quite cheap, I think. It depends obviously what you want. If you want like a full sprite pack, you might need to find a designer for you. But if you just want some like placeholder images, there's definitely going to be freebies online you can just use. There are some kind of software that you can use to get started that are free, such as Blender. This is a really, really good 3D modeling software. It's crazy how much you can do with it, really. I picked it up for a little while and it was really good fun to learn. It has things like, obviously you model your 3D objects and then you can like animate them and stuff. It's super cool. And it's all free. Inkscape, so that's 2D. So this is kind of like an equivalent of Illustrator, which, you know, if you're really passionate about this, you might pick up a kind of paid software like Adobe Illustrator, but Inkscape is a really good thing to get you started. And of course, it's always Paint. You know, if you want to start really simple, there's nothing wrong with using Paint. Then the sound. Now, sound is kind of an interesting one because I don't think you can really emulate like a lot of the sounds in games yourself with just like your like laptop microphone. So I definitely have a look at online for sounds, for things like animal noises or like maybe a player, whatnot. I think music is definitely something you can do yourself. You know, you've got the wealth of the internet of making like funky music and stuff, but there's also things like GarageBand on Macs, which make it really easy to get into if you like. there is this really great browser music generator, which, yeah, I really recommend you check this out because it's crazy how good the music can sound with just like a few drag and drop of like arrows. It's hard to explain, but it's a really good piece of software. So I'd recommend you check that out if you're looking to make some music for your game. Of course, then we need to look at things like physics, if this is going to be something that you do yourself. Now, if you want to add collisions to your game, you're going to look at things like checking the bounding box of your sprites. If you want to add gravity, then a kind of simple way of implementing gravity would be move your sprites down by a gravity constant. So it looks like they're falling. Really what happened is the y is increasing. And there's projectiles. There's a kind of concept in kind of mechanical maths called SUVAT, which is basically a list of equations that kind of let you calculate, how far a projectile is going to go, given you set it off at this speed and it goes this high and whatnot. So there's definitely ways you can kind of do things like projectiles using SUVAT, which is really cool. And then there's UI, which I really enjoy. So this is kind of the non-game elements of the like the visuals, such as the menus and the toolbars. And I love this because it makes use of existing knowledge. So if you already know React or Vue, Angular, you can definitely use it here to make it life nice and easy. Just making some like small components. And Vue works really well in my opinion, although kind of shifting towards React at the moment just because it's what I've been using recently. But they're both really great frameworks for adding the components to your screen. And then there's some extra tools you can consider. So TypeScript is really, really great for game development. I mean, obviously it's great in a lot of situations, but especially when you're doing quite heavy function-based architecture where it's very easy for things to get, your variables to get like undefined and whatnot. So TypeScript works really, really well. Of course, Node, if you're going to be using any NPM packages, then Node is kind of a given, which is cool. Socket.io is a kind of a library used for multiplayer. So if you want to have like live multiplayer with another person during your game, sockets can be really great for this. And a project board, I think it's really underrated kind of piece of kit for this because it's not obviously technical as such, but I think it can really keep you motivated to keep going if you have a project board where you can like put all your to-dos and then drag them across and like tick them off when they're done. Personally, that really helps keep me motivated with projects. So to recap, plan a game that will be achievable, something that's not going to take you years and years of time, because realistically, if it does, unless you're going to like quit your job, it's probably never going to happen. Keep the project timeline quite short so that you can kind of make a game and then finish it and be really happy, and then you'll kind of get that hit of dopamine and you'll be like, oh, I want to make another game, which would be cool. Try and plan the kind of technical aspects, and then you can start to look at like a game idea. So like, as I said, your technical ability is going to like influence how much you can do with your game design. So make sure they're both kind of realistic for your skill level. And figure out if you're going to use any libraries, and if so, which ones, because you want to do a little bit of research into these libraries to see, can they do it on X device, Is it going to be possible to make this game using this framework? And consider a task board if it's going to help you with planning and keeping you motivated. So that's everything from me. I really appreciate you listening, and I really hope that you give game development a try. Thank you for listening.
Katie, what a great talk on JavaScript games. I mean, it's so interesting. JavaScript is so powerful that you can do so much with it. And I think people sometimes think it is like a kiddie language where you can just build the simple games, but you've shown us how much more powerful it is and what more can be done. So thank you so much for that. I know I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. Everyone, don't forget to go follow Katie on socials so you can keep up to date with all the exciting things going on there.